The most evil experiments ever conducted on humans. Throughout recorded history, science and curiosity have driven human progress, curing disease, extending life, illuminating the mysteries of the body and mind. But woven into the story of medical advancement is a darker thread: the deliberate, systematic use of human beings as test subjects, stripped of consent, stripped of dignity, and in thousands of cases, stripped of their very lives. These are not the stories of rogue scientists working in shadows. In many cases, they were state-sponsored programs, conducted in hospitals, prisons, military installations, and concentration camps, sanctioned by governments, blessed by institutions, and hidden from the world for decades. This is their record. The Factory of Death. In the frozen plains of northeastern China, in a facility the size of a small city, Imperial Japan constructed what many historians regard as the most extensive and horrifying program of human experimentation in all of recorded history. It was called Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit operating under the Kwantung Army. At its peak, the complex at Pingfang employed over 3,000 personnel. It held thousands of prisoners at any given time, and it operated for 8 years in near total secrecy. The prisoners were known internally as maruta, the Japanese word for logs. Not patients, not prisoners, logs, to be used and discarded. They were primarily Chinese, Korean, and Soviet civilians and prisoners of war. Some were soldiers, some were farmers, some were women, some were children. What was done to them inside those walls belonged to no recognized category of medicine. Researchers deliberately infected subjects with bubonic plague, cholera, typhus, anthrax, tracking the progress of disease through the body with cold precision, offering no treatment, recording every stage of suffering as clinical data. Surgeons performed vivisections, operations conducted on living, fully conscious human beings to study the effects of disease on internal organs in real time, without anesthesia, without mercy. Subjects were placed in pressure chambers to determine exactly how much atmospheric compression the human body could endure before organs ruptured. Others were left outdoors in sub-zero temperatures, arms and legs deliberately exposed to study frostbite progression. Limbs were amputated, and the experiments continued on what remained. The killing extended beyond the walls of the facility. Entire villages were targeted in field tests, bombed with plague-infected fleas dropped from aircraft, water supplies poisoned, populations observed, deaths catalogued. Estimates of the total death toll from Unit 731's operations range from 3,000 to over 200,000 victims. At the end of the war, as American forces occupied Japan, Unit 731 commander Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii made a calculation. He approached intelligence with an offer. The data gathered from his experiments, years of biological warfare research purchased with human lives in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The United States accepted. Most of Unit 731's leadership never stood trial. Ishii died in 1959, a free man, of throat cancer. The data they provided was later assessed by many researchers as scientifically unreliable. The conditions were too extreme, the variables too uncontrolled. The suffering had been immense, the scientific gain negligible, the moral cost incalculable. The Nazi medical experiments. No chapter in the history of human experimentation is as extensively documented or as deeply disturbing as the medical experiments conducted by Nazi physicians inside the concentration camps of the Third Reich. The experiments operated on a single foundational premise that the subjects were not fully human, that their lives carried no weight, that their suffering was at most a minor inconvenience against the demands of German medical medicine and racial ideology. It was not a premise held by outliers or madmen alone. It was institutionalized, systematic, signed off in offices, funded with budgets, published in journals. Dr. Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in May 1943. He was 31 years old. He was charming, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a near-perfect academic record. His colleagues called him the Angel of Death, though rarely to his face. Mengele met the transport trains personally. He stood on the platform as thousands poured off, gaunt, disoriented, terrified, and directed them with a casual flick of his hand. Left to the gas chambers, right to the barracks and the laboratories. He was obsessed with twins. He subjected twin children to comparative anatomy experiments, infecting one twin with typhus while using the other as a living control. He sewed twins together in crude surgical attempts to create conjoined siblings, stitching their veins and organs together to observe what would happen. He injected dye directly into the eyes of children to see whether he could change their eye color. Most of his subjects died. Most of those who survived were permanently damaged, physically, psychologically, irreversibly. But Mengele was not alone. He was not an aberration. He was a participant in a vast, organized program. At Dachau, prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers to simulate the conditions of extreme altitude, subjected to the equivalent of explosive decompression until their lungs hemorrhaged and they died, in experiments designed to help the Luftwaffe understand the survival limits of downed pilots. The same rationale, military necessity, justified experiments in which prisoners were submerged in tanks of ice water for hours, were stripped naked, and left outdoors in freezing temperatures for entire nights. What is the minimum body temperature from which a human being can be revived? The Nazi researchers wanted an exact number. They got one. At Ravensbrück, physicians deliberately cut open prisoners' legs and infected the wounds with gas gangrene, wood shavings, and broken glass to study battlefield wound infections. Subjects underwent forced sterilizations, bone transplantations, deliberate malaria infections, surgical removal of limbs from healthy bodies. The Nuremberg doctors' trial of 1946 and 1947 prosecuted 23 physicians. 7 were sentenced to death and hanged. But from the wreckage came something lasting, the Nuremberg Code of 1947. 10 principles. The first and most fundamental of them was this: the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Every ethics review board on Earth, every informed consent form, every clinical trial protocol, they all trace their lineage to the necessity of articulating after Auschwitz what should have been self-evident.
The Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study was conducted by the United States Public Health Service for 40 years. It was not a wartime emergency measure. It was not a covert operation. It was a federally funded, bureaucratically administered, peer-reviewed scientific program which deliberately withheld medical treatment from black men dying of syphilis in order to watch them die. The study began in 1932 in Macon County, Alabama, one of the poorest counties in the United States. Macon County was majority black, largely agricultural, and had almost no access to medical care. The Public Health Service estimated that nearly 40% of black men in the county had syphilis. 399 men with syphilis were enrolled. 201 more without the disease were enrolled as controls. They were mostly sharecroppers, men with little formal education, men who had never seen a doctor. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local term used for a range of ailments. They were not told they had syphilis. They were not told the study's true purpose. They were offered free meals, free burial insurance, and free medical examinations, small, carefully calibrated incentives for men with almost nothing. In 1947, penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis, a cheap, effective cure, an end to the disease that was killing these men. The researchers did not offer it to them. They actively worked to ensure the men received no treatment elsewhere, contacting local draft boards to prevent participants from receiving penicillin when called up during World War II. The experiment continued for 25 more years. Men died, their wives were infected, their children were born with congenital syphilis. The study was not stopped by a regulator. It was not halted by a congressional inquiry. It was not terminated by the conscience of its own researchers. It was stopped by a whistleblower, Peter Buxton, a venereal disease investigator who had raised alarms internally for years, been dismissed each time, and finally leaked the story to journalist Jean Heller. When the story broke in July 1972, the public outcry was immediate. The study was terminated within months. In 1997, 65 years after it began, President Clinton formally apologized to the 8 surviving participants. Most of the men who had been enrolled were long dead. The legacy of Tuskegee did not end with the apology. Research has repeatedly documented that distrust of the medical establishment within African American communities, including reluctance to participate in clinical trials and vaccine hesitancy, is directly connected to the memory of what the United States government did in Macon County, Alabama. Some harms have no clear endpoint. Project MK-Ultra, the CIA's war on the human mind. The Cold War was, among other things, a war of perception. And in the paranoid calculus of American intelligence in the early 1950s, a terrifying possibility had taken hold, that the Soviet Union had developed techniques capable of breaking prisoners, manufacturing confessions, and reprogramming the human mind itself. The Americans' response was Project MK-Ultra, a secret CIA program that for over 2 decades conducted hundreds of experiments on mind control, behavioral manipulation, and psychological dismantlement on unwitting subjects across the United States and Canada. MK-Ultra was formally approved by CIA Director Allen Dulles in April 1953. It was placed under the direction of Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist, a government servant, and one of the most quietly monstrous figures of the 20th century. The program encompassed at least 150 separate research projects. They were conducted at 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, mental health facilities, all of them unaware, in many cases, that they were receiving CIA funding through a network of front organizations. The subjects, drug addicts, mental patients, prisoners, and, on more than one occasion, ordinary civilians who had simply walked into the wrong situation, had no idea a government program was being conducted on them. LSD became the program's most infamous instrument. CIA operatives dosed subjects without their knowledge, mental patients, prisoners, and, at least once, the guests of a dinner party, with lysergic acid diethylamide, sitting back to observe the effects. The hope was that LSD could be weaponized, used to destabilize enemy agents,
to extract confessions, to create amnesia. In November 1953, a civilian biochemist named Frank Olson was secretly dosed with LSD at a CIA retreat. He was told nothing. Days later, he fell from the window of a New York hotel room to his death. The CIA ruled it a suicide. His family believes otherwise. The case has never been conclusively resolved. Beyond LSD, MK-Ultra researchers experimented with electroconvulsive therapy to erase memories, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, verbal and sexual abuse, cocktails of barbiturates and amphetamines administered simultaneously. In Montreal, a psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron received CIA funding to conduct what he called psychic driving. Patients, many of them admitted for relatively minor conditions, were placed in medically induced sleep for weeks or months at a time. During this time, recordings of repeated statements played on a loop in their ears in an attempt to erase and rewrite their personalities from the ground up. His patients emerged with profound and permanent psychological damage. Many lost years of memory. Some lost the ability to function at a basic level. None had agreed to what was done to them. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MK-Ultra files, anticipating congressional investigations. A 1977 Senate hearing confirmed the program's existence using the documents that survived. No criminal charges were brought. Sidney Gottlieb retired to a rural farm in Virginia, where he tended goats and reportedly devoted himself to hospice work. He died in 1999.